Previously, we calculated a column called EPS, earnings per share, in this quarterly income data table. So because the quarterly income data table has a quarterly frequency, so each date is basically the last date in a quarter. Okay, so accordingly, the EPS we're calculating is a quarterly earnings per share. So how much as a shareholder you get from the company if you're holding just one share in that quarter. Okay, but sometimes we need to have an annual measure of earnings per share. Okay, over the course of 1 year, as a shareholder, if you're holding just one share, how much earnings you're getting over the course of a whole year, which is covers 4 quarters, of course. Okay, so what I have in mind, let me show you the Excel file. Okay, so for example, if we're standing at the end of the first quarter in 2022, okay, we want to calculate how much total earnings per share we have earned in the past year up to the point of this first quarter. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to sum up the 4 quarters before the first quarter of year 2022 and see how much earnings per share I get in those 4 quarters before the current quarter. Okay, so to do that in Excel, it's pretty straightforward. You can just use the sum function and sum up those 4 quarters before the current quarter we're focusing on. Okay, so this is gonna tell you, okay, as a shareholder, you earned $6.02 in the previous 4 quarters. Okay, you can also just copy this formula downward. Okay, then each particular cell here is basically measuring how much earnings you have earned in the previous 4 quarters. So how can we kind of implement this idea in Power BI? How can I construct a column, let's call it EPS last year, okay, which tells me how much earnings per share I get in the past 4 quarters relative to the current quarter I'm standing at. So to do that, I will just again click on this quarterly income table, and I'm going to introduce a new column. Well, I'm first going to introduce this column called year quarter. Okay, we have already constructed a very similar column before under the historical daily data set. Okay, here I just want to introduce this new column into this quarterly income table. Okay, the basic structure, basic DAX code is the same. You can check the previous definition of year quarter in the historical daily table. Okay, so I'm going to have this column constructed, and yeah, it's going to be here. And next, I'm going to construct a new column called EPS last year. Okay, I'm going to again go to quarterly income, and I'm going to have a new column, and again I'm going to paste my DAX code here for EPS last year. Okay, so in this DAX code, I'm going to first use this window function, okay, to get a table which has 4 rows. This window function has a very similar structure as the index function we have learned previously. Okay, so the window function will work on this data table, quarterly income, and using the original table, the window function will first make sure this table is identified by stock symbol and date. So basically each row is unique in terms of the stock symbol and date. And then the window function is going to partition the quarterly income table into several groups based on the stock symbol. Okay, in our case, there's just one stock symbol in this table. Okay, it's Apple. But in case you have several stocks, okay, in your data table, then it's going to be partitioned into different groups based on different stock symbol. All right. Then after this partition by, the window function is going to use this order by clause to order within each group or within each partition order the rows according to the date in a ascending order. Okay, so again, recall the index function we learned before. We are pretty much doing a very similar exercise here. We're just taking the original data set. We make sure this data set, each row in this data set is identified by stock symbol and date. Then we partition this data set into different partitions or groups, each group being a particular stock symbol. Okay, then within that group, we're going to rank the observations or the rows according to their dates in ascending order. Okay, after doing this, original data set is sorted in a pattern. We can easily identify certain observations. Okay, so basically the window function instructs Power BI to retrieve 4 rows out of this newly sorted data set. Okay, which 4 rows? Okay, that's gonna be specified by the first 4 arguments. So window function is gonna retrieve 4 rows before the current row, all the way to 1 row before the current row. Okay, so basically based on what the current row is, Power BI is gonna retrieve 1 row above it, 2 rows above it, 3 rows above it, and 4 rows above it. Okay, those 4 rows are going to be retrieved. So basically we're going from 1 row prior to the current row all the way to 4 rows prior to the current row. This REL indicates we're talking about relative positions. So -1 is 1 row relative to the current row. Okay, 1 row before the current row. That's why we use -1. If we use +1, that means 1 row after the current row. Okay, so -1 relative means I try to retrieve 1 row prior to the current row, and the -4 relative means I'm trying to retrieve 4 rows prior to the current row. Okay, we are not just retrieving these 2 rows. Okay, -1, -4. We're retrieving the entire range between -1, -4. So we're going to retrieve 1 row before the current row, 2 rows before, 3 rows before, all the way to 4 rows before the current row. So that's what this window function try to tell Power BI to do. Well, we talk about this argument called REL, relative position. So this indicates that those 2 numbers, -1, -4, is a relative concept. Okay, the position relative to the current row. Okay, again, to illustrate the point, let's go back to the Excel here. So if our current row is this green row, so the relative position 1 row above it is going to be this row. Okay, 4 row above it is going to be this row. So the window function with those relative positions is basically trying to retrieve those 4 rows in purple. Okay, how about we specify instead of absolute, instead of relative, we can specify it as absolute, ABS. Okay, so in this case, those 2 numbers, -1, -4, is going to be a absolute position. So in this case, what does this tell Power BI to do? So still Power BI will look at the current row. All right, so let's go back to Excel. Again, assuming our current row is here. All right, and based on the current row, we'll know we're currently working on Apple. All right, so this stock symbol will tell us what's the current partition we are working on. All right, so once Power BI knows your current partition, it's gonna retrieve the absolute position in this current partition. So Power BI is gonna look through the partition of Apple and look for the very last row all the way to 4 rows before the very last row. Okay, so basically Power BI is gonna look at those 4 rows. That's the last 4 rows in the current partition related to Apple. Okay, that's Apple's observation, the last 4 observation for Apple, which is the 3rd quarter of year 23 all the way to the 2nd quarter of year 24. That's the last 4 rows related to Apple. Okay, so this row is the very last row for Apple, and that's gonna be this -1 absolute. Okay, it's the very last row for the current partition, and this -4 absolute basically corresponds to this row. Okay, we're talking about absolute positions. Okay, this is the fourth last row for the current partition. Okay, so basically once you specify -4 absolute, -1 absolute, the window function is gonna retrieve the 4 rows, the 4 very last rows for the Apple partition. So basically, I'll give this a different color. Basically, Power BI is gonna retrieve these 4 rows based on the specification of -4 ABS and -1 ABS. Okay. So anyway, we do not need the absolute positions. We actually need the relative position, because for each row, we try to retrieve the previous 4 quarters of earnings per share. Okay. So this is how this Windows function works.